Welcome to Bottled Petrichor. In this new series, we sit with experts and learn how to navigate tools and resources necessary for students and researchers in the field of Islamic studies. Our expert today is Dr. Jonathan Allen, a postdoctoral researcher in the Persian Department at the University of Maryland, and he will be talking to us about manuscripts. Welcome, Doctor. How are you?
I'm doing pretty well. I have to be totally honest. We're at my parents' right now. Fortunately, the kids are out with my parents and my wife, and they shouldn't be back for a while. But there may be like loud screaming later on in the interview. I didn't sleep as well as I could have last night. I'll put it that way. So if I make any mistakes in what I'm about to say, I'm going to attribute it to poor sleep and children interrupting us throughout the night. Otherwise, pretty well. And I'm really happy to be here. I'll talk about this in a moment, but I feel a little hesitant calling myself an expert in manuscripts. This is something that I kind of have gotten into over really the last, year, several months. And as I'll mention in a minute, and I think this applies to kind of many people in our field, this is not something that I was trained in extensively as a graduate student. So it's very much kind of a learning process for me as well. But anyway. I'm happy to be here, and I love talking about manuscripts. There's so much fun, and they're just so cool. So.
Understood, and we're happy to have you. Before we start, do you mind telling us a bit about yourself and your research?
Sure. So I completed my PhD in history 2 years ago, almost exactly 2 years ago. My training is in Ottoman religious history kind of broadly. My dissertation was on saints and sainthood in the early modern Ottoman Empire. And that's still kind of my primary interest. I'm really interested in the ways that both Muslim saints, but also Christian and Jewish and other traditions, saints, and the sort of discourses and practices of sainthood and sanctity and sort of associated concepts, entities, practices, their sort of social and cultural roles in the broader Ottoman Empire. And so that's been one of my key focuses. That said, we all have to make a living. And so after I finished my PhD, I actually started into a postdoctoral position, not directly related to my research, but instead having to do with both sort of some technical aspects, which I can mention a bit briefly, and also kind of the study of, if you will, I guess broadly, sort of the communication side of things in the history of Islam, and really kind of the Islamic world, a term that I'll mention a bit more later. So initially, the project that I worked on, which is a Mellon-supported project, out of the University of Maryland, but working with a number of other people, focused on improving OCR, so optical character recognition, for Arabic script printed texts. So this involves both kind of technical work, but also studying the history of print and typography in Arabic script, something that I knew absolutely nothing about before starting this position. We've since sort of begun to transition into the second phase of our big picture project, and that's improving handwritten text recognition for Arabic script manuscripts. And so this has involved over the last few months me really kind of transitioning to, again, a field of study that I was familiar with more so than like the history of typography in the Arabic script world, but something that I wasn't exactly trained in. And so it's involved a lot of learning, both in terms of manuscript culture and the study of manuscripts, as well as some of the initial sort of technical stuff that we're doing in regards to handwritten text recognition. And I'll talk a bit more about that later on in this talk. So that's kind of how I got into this particular area. It's not, I wouldn't say that it's my main area of focus, but it's something that I have done a lot more with over the last several months to year, and something that I'll be continuing with for a long time to come. It's also an area of study and work that I've realized, and I knew this for a long time going through graduate school and afterwards, that as a field we need to improve upon, and I'll try to touch on some of the reasons for that as I go. Let me actually go ahead and start my PowerPoint so you guys don't have to just look at me. All right, so let me make sure that my view box, there we go, okay, that's better. All right. So what I wanted to do today is really, as the title says, kind of give an introduction to Arabic script manuscripts. And I'm going to talk a minute in what exactly I mean by Arabic script and why I've chosen that term. But the first thing that I do kind of want to mention is to follow up on what I was saying a minute ago. This will come as no surprise, I think, to many of our viewers, our listeners, that the study of manuscripts, particularly paleography and codicology, so the two kind of primary, if you will, sciences of manuscripts, for Islamic studies has in many ways it's been one of these areas of study that leaves a lot to be desired. I'll put it that way. When I started my graduate work, oh my goodness, like over a decade or something ago, decade and a half ago, I initially started out in medieval studies. So I eventually ended up in early modern. But my idea back then was I was going to combine kind of Western medieval and Islamic stuff in some fashion. That didn't end up being workable for me, at least. But it meant that in my master's work, I covered some stuff in the kind of Latinate world and then other stuff in the Islamic world. And one of the things that I discovered, and I think this will be familiar to many people, is that for the study of Latin manuscripts, and if you will, Latinate manuscripts, so going into the early modern period, there's just a much larger kind of apparatus of study. There's a lot more material. There are a lot more resources, and it's much more integrated into these fields. So, if you do a degree in medieval studies, the odds are very good that you'll have at least one course in paleography and perhaps something in codicology as well. For our field, this is less true. Now, of course, this will vary from institution to institution, but in my case, the only formal exposure I had to manuscript studies as a grad student was a summer workshop in Istanbul on Ottoman Turkish, and as part of the summer workshop, we had some sessions devoted kind of to paleography, but to be honest, they were fairly rudimentary. I never had anything sort of formally on codicology. In terms of using manuscripts, there's always sort of the assumption, and I think this is again true of many departments and programs, that you would be using manuscripts and you would be finding them. But in terms of kind of formal instruction, both in paleography, codicology, but also in what we might call kind of this digital manuscript culture, digital manuscript studies, not really very much training at all. So this is something that I think is improving, and really just over the last couple of years, there have been more moves, I think, towards improving the situation. There's a little bit of literature now that's available, and I'll reference that later. But there's still a lot of room to grow. And one of the things that we hope to do with our NEH-funded, so many acronyms I can't keep track of them, but with our efforts at improving HTR, at handwritten text recognition, is to kind of facilitate some of this growth in manuscript studies and to make Arabic script to manuscripts more accessible, but also hopefully to spur the development of other resources and communities and things like this devoted to their study. So it's a very long introduction to really kind of my introduction. So what I want to do today is kind of give an overview of the Arabic script to manuscript tradition. And what I really kind of want to do is to encourage people to get into this stuff, both to realize the utility of these manuscripts for whatever you're doing, to sort of see some entry points into this field, and also to explore a little bit of length kind of how you go about finding digitized manuscripts and some of the ways that you can use them and some of the limitations. So my own work right now primarily focuses on digitized manuscripts. I'm not currently really interacting with physical ones too much. And the work that I'm doing is very much oriented towards how we use digitized stuff. And I think in many ways that's great. I think digitized manuscripts are a real advantage in our field and other fields. That said, there are also limitations, there are difficulties, and I hope to kind of cover some of those as well. In general, just to kind of give a spur to get people thinking about these things and hopefully encourage our viewers to search them out some more. All right. So first of all, I want to just hit on a few kind of key themes and terms. I'm going to try to avoid being too technical since this is a relatively short talk, and instead kind of address some kind of big themes, some really broad terms. These are terms and themes that I think help to kind of orient the field of manuscript studies, what its sort of parameters are, and what we can get out of manuscripts. So first of all, the distinction between paleography and codicology. I mean, simply put, paleography is the study of the script, so of deciphering the script, kind of from the beginning, making sense of what these texts actually say, but also in things like investigating changes of script style over time. I'm thinking about, if you will, the sort of socio-cultural implications of script. And we'll talk a little bit later about script styles and things like this and what we might be able to discern from them. And a lot of paleography and a lot of using manuscripts is honestly just sitting down and deciphering these things. And as you can see just from the examples that I've put here on this initial slide, you get lots and lots of variation within Arabic script, depending on where you are and depending on scribal hands and things like that. Codicology is we might say, kind of the study of the book as a physical object. So here we're thinking about things like, what is the book made out of? What kind of paper is employed? How are the pages stitched together? Things like the shape of the book, issues of layout. As we'll see, this is we're a bit more limited on the digital side here because, of course, when you're looking at a digitized manuscript, a digitized exemplar, you're not actually handling the book, and you're very much dependent on what has the digitizing archive actually digitized, right? Are they showing you all of the book? What is the resolution of the images, this sort of thing. So in some cases, you might be able to examine watermarks in digitized manuscripts. In other cases, you're lucky if you can make out all of the letters because the resolution is so poor. Arabic script and Islamicate are two terms that I think are helpful in thinking about the scope of this manuscript tradition. So I've used Arabic script because this encompasses all languages that use Arabic script. So of course there are kind of the obvious big ones: Arabic, Persian, Ottoman Turkish, and Urdu. But of course there are a lot of other languages as well, a few of which we'll mention a bit later on, that employ Arabic script. I've chosen Islamicate because the Arabic script manuscript tradition, while the majority of these manuscripts were produced by Muslims of some variety or another, Christian Arabic is also quite common. And particularly, let's say, in the early modern Ottoman context, a fair amount of production is by Christian Arabic speakers and readers and writers. And I like the term Islamicate in this context and in others because it sort of brings in multiple confessions under this one kind of broad cultural and social umbrella. And I think works really well as a descriptor. The reason too is that, of course, many of these texts in manuscript form, are not by any definition religious. We'll be looking at, for instance, some scientific manuscripts in a little bit. And Islamicate, I think, is one of these terms that kind of picks up on the cultural distinctiveness without reducing it to religious specificity. Manuscript and document is another one of these places where things are the definitions are a bit thin. So manuscripts are primarily what I'm concerned with in my own work and what this talk will be with. And their manuscripts, we might say, are codices, right? So they're bound, usually, although we'll see that's not always the case, books that were meant to be in a particular format, usually as a sort of a unitary object. So this might be a single textbook, or just as likely, probably more likely, this might be a majmua, so a composite text. And there are a lot of ways to define majmua, and we can talk about that a little bit later. Document is a bit more, a little bit harder to define. So generally, you can tell the difference between manuscript and document, but not always. Documents will generally be found in archives, right? So the most in Islamic studies, the most obvious example, of course, the Ottoman archives, which are full of documents of various sorts. in lots of different, interestingly, in lots of different formats. Another kind of well-known source of documents is the Cairo Geniza and its analogs in other places and periods, in which you have loose text of various sorts. That said, the boundary between manuscript and document is often very unclear. So manuscripts will often contain material that we might think of as documentary. So notices of say, births or of contracts or of things like that. And so this line isn't necessarily always clear. Likewise, script style and hand, which is an important issue of paleography. Sometimes, and we'll talk about this a bit more in some more depth in a bit, there are pretty clear script styles, which represent ways of writing Arabic script that are relatively stable, right? So that you can identify as being a particular style of writing that has certain features and that is reproduced over time, right? So a really good example, because it's quite stable and recognizable, if we think of like a sort of classic Ottoman Nosc, which I think almost everyone will have encountered at some point. It's very influential in typography. So a lot of early typefaces are basically looking to Ottoman Nosc as their exemplars. So there you have a script style that's very stable. The proportions of the letters are pretty stable. Within a script style, you will find lots of different hands. So hands are the variations that are brought by individual scribes. So these are not liable to be reproduced necessarily over time, right? They're the particularities of individual scribes, and also of, we might think of the context of writing. So in this middle example here, if we're looking at this marginalia and interlinear, obviously it's just much smaller. And so this introduces particular constraints. But we'll come back to script style in a little bit, because there's a lot that you can kind of recognize from it, as well as from the variation of hands. Can tell you a lot. Something else that I want to mention briefly before I get into some more sort of particulars of manuscripts. When I talk about manuscripts, I think it's important that we also have in the back of our mind other forms of reproducing Arabic script texts. And often there's this kind of idea that there's this sort of neat continuum from manuscript culture to print culture, and typographic print does away with manuscripts. This is kind of the conventional narrative for the Western world, for Latinate texts. It's sometimes applied to the Arabic script world as well. It's not super accurate, and I think it's helpful to think about, particularly when we're thinking about the size and the scope of the Arabic script manuscript tradition, to think about some of the ways in which, if you will, manuscripts and handwritten text culture continue into the print age. And this is something that's been of much concern to me over the last year or two. And I've just given a couple of examples to illustrate this. And I can come back to maybe to this a bit later if we have time, this sort of transition and movement and what it entailed. But one of the points where we see a real kind of, if you will, intermediate form between manuscripts and print culture, of course, is in the lithograph. And I think it's worth sort of bringing up lithography because while lithograph texts don't necessarily, they're not manuscripts in the sort of strict sense, right? They're, for those who aren't familiar, probably everyone has seen lithograph texts, but lithograph texts are basically, these are texts that were handwritten on a printing stone, so hence the litho, and that allow for mass reproduction of handwritten text. So they're this curious sort of hybrid between the manuscript in the strict sense. But what it means is that under the rise of lithography, and then later under photocopying, well into the early 21st century, a lot of the elements of manuscript culture and of handwritten text production continued, albeit in a new form. I bring this up because I think it's important, and I'll go ahead and go to the next slide here, that when we're thinking about the scope of the manuscript tradition for Arabic script and its sort of chronological range, it's much larger than many people, than we tend to assume, than we tend to think. So that leads me on to some, I say codicological considerations, but really some very kind of broad outlining first of the Arabic script manuscript tradition in terms of its size and geographical spread. And then I want to talk just a little bit about some of the variation, codicological variation that we see within this tradition in terms of things like substrates, layout, binding, stuff like that. I'll be relatively brief because I'm really trying to kind of concentrate on things that are sort of digitally visible. So first of all, just a bit about the scope of the manuscript tradition. This is something that I honestly did not know before I started work as a postdoctoral researcher. And it's something that we are still kind of really exploring. So when we were sitting down to write our grant proposal to the NEH to work on HTR, one of the things that we wondered and that we wanted to include was, well, how many Arabic script manuscripts are there? As it turns out, nobody really knows. We surveyed a number of scholars in the field to kind of get a feel. I looked through pretty much every online repository, through lots of catalogs and things like that. The answer that we came up with is somewhere in the millions. But to be honest, it's very hard to answer. And part of it is because of how you define a manuscript, which in itself is not always obvious. And also the fact that Arabic script manuscripts are very widely distributed geographically. So obviously they're present in lots of libraries and archives around the world, collected from various places, really from the 17th century forward. But they're also still present in a lot of private collections, so individuals. They're also present in places where they're still in use. So in mosques and madrasas and other localities all around the Islamic world. And they're also still being produced. So while in most places manuscript culture has become really an art form, so you might commission a manuscript as an art piece essentially. In say West Africa, there is still some degree of manuscript production for even with print. And in some places, manuscripts continued as the dominant form of textual transmission well into the 20th century. So we're talking about a manuscript culture, very broadly conceived, that begins basically with the rise of Islam, so within the first century, and that continues pretty robustly all the way up to at least the early 20th century, and really well through the 20th century in some places. So one way of, I think a really kind of cool anecdote for the vitality and the sort of the chronological spread of the Arabic manuscript tradition well into, I guess, really to right before, maybe a little bit right after World War I, American University in Beirut, professors there were regularly producing manuscript copies of their work, and manuscripts were integrated into teaching activities in the courses there, like as text, so not as sort of the way that we approach manuscripts, but in the way that you would, like acquire a textbook, obviously very old text, like sort of classical text, but also professors producing recent material, so stuff looking at like Darwinian evolution and things, were still being produced in manuscript form. Now, the reasons for that are a whole other topic, and I'll share a bibliography for those who are interested to follow this up. But I think it reveals kind of the vitality of this tradition, even in the face of typographic print, for quite a long time. I think that the more that you get into manuscripts and sort of explore these, you start to kind of understand why this tradition has remained vital for so long, and kind of what can be done with manuscripts, not just on the aesthetic level, but on, if you will, kind of the information transmission and almost kind of like data science level, if you will. So chronological spread, we have geographic spread from not just West Africa, but even in the Americas after a certain point, all the way to Southeast Asia and China. And in overall numbers of what survives to the present, I mean, we're talking at least in the millions. In terms of what has been digitized and is available of discrete manuscripts, we're in at least the hundreds of thousands. And I tabulated as many as I could find. And I wish I had written that number down. I have it somewhere in my files, but we're talking at least in the hundreds of thousands. Now, as we'll see, the way that you can use these digitized manuscripts is going to vary. So, take that number when we think of that number. That has to be in consideration. That said, there's a lot out there, right? And that's, I think, a really important takeaway. So we have the chronological spread, we have the geographic spread. One would expect that within that chronological and geographic diversity and spread, there would be a lot of codicological and other types of variation. And of course, that's the case. I want to just touch on a few of those to give you a kind of a feel for some of this diversity and variety within the tradition. So first of all, in terms of substrates, I think many viewers will probably be kind of vaguely familiar that in early Islam, so in the beginnings of the Arabic script manuscript tradition, parchment is fairly widely used. And we have a kind of cool example here in the lower right-hand corner of a Quran written in so-called Kufic script, written on parchment. And you can actually kind of, even at this resolution, you can kind of tell that this is animal skin and not paper. So parchment will be around for a few centuries. Generally, in most of the Islamic world, it disappears. It'll reappear sporadically here and there for, I think, probably kind of novelty reasons. It lasts longer in North Africa than anywhere else. And in general, North Africa tends to be a bit of an outlier, both codicologically and paleographically. So features that that sort of disappeared elsewhere often kind of survive in North Africa, or they're articulated in different ways in different directions. I really like this example down here because it has both substrates. It has parchment at the center, and then you can see that the parchment has been framed within paper. So this was added probably in the 16th century in the Safavid Empire, almost certainly. So you have sort of classic Persianate illumination, and then you have this nice little border, and then somebody has done a 16th century imitation of the Kufic script. So a really lovely example of reuse, of preserving this parchment in a new format. So parchment is used in a few cases early on, a little bit later in the Maghreb, but in general, paper will be the dominant substrate. And the sources of paper will vary. So there is production in the Islamic world. After a certain point, really well in the later Middle Ages, Western European paper will predominate, at least in the kind of the western half of the Islamic world. This actually was an issue of some, I don't know if debate is the right word, but of some anxiety among some people on the Muslim side of things, whether it's okay to use, say, Italian-produced paper that has a watermark with a cross in it. And there are fatwa on this, the general consensus being that it's fine. And so when you are able to examine watermarks in paper, you can often detect where this paper was coming from, right? Italian paper mills are an important source, particularly in the Middle Ages, and then there are others later on. Unfortunately, in a digitized environment, it's not always possible to look at these sorts of things. So this is one of the potential drawbacks of digitization. You may or may not be able to detect watermarks. With this and with a lot of other things, a lot is dependent on the quality of the scans. So your substrates, paper is predominant. I won't talk a whole lot about binding and sort of book format, in part because it's hard to kind of look at binding digitally in most cases. But I'll just note that, again, you do have a good bit of variety. While binding is used in most of the Islamic world, and there's a number of different forms of binding and of sort of book composition, you'll have outliers. So in West Africa, and the example down here in this corner, this is an example from, I think, 18th century West Africa, but it might be 19th century. Manuscripts tend to be produced as loose leaves that then are stacked and placed in a leather satchel. So here this is an interesting point where what we think of as a manuscript in most contexts may not always apply exactly in others. So you might have, if you have loose leaves, these things can get disaggregated, and you might have individual texts that have been separated from their original context. So perhaps there's some sort of composite moved around, or shuffled, and that sort of thing. In terms of shape, the sort of rectangular codex is going to predominate with the portrait orientation. Will become dominant pretty early on, again, except in in North Africa, where the landscape layout, right, will be around for a lot longer. But again, you get all kinds of things. You get the so-called the Safina orientation, so in technical terms, the long, skinny rectangle with the portrait orientation. You also get things like scrolls, and this up here in the top left-hand corner is a really lovely example, which we might look at a bit more later. And this would be wound up and placed inside of a little like amulet case. In terms of layout, so with on the page, of course, there's a ton of variation, and we'll talk about that a bit more, I think, with scribal practices and things like that. The takeaway here is that within the manuscript tradition, just in terms of sort of codicological elements, the way that books are put together, what they're made out of, there's a lot of variety. Even in things like ink. You get different parts of the Islamic world have different forms of ink, so different colors, different chemical compositions, some of which preserve better than others. And again, North Africa and West Africa are a bit of the outliers here, where because of the chemical composition of their ink, sometimes they don't survive quite as well. Something else to keep in mind, too, in terms of survival, is different climates, of course, are going to affect manuscripts in very different ways. So if we think about the climate of West Africa or of Southeast Asia, this is going to affect things like just manuscript survival, but also potentially legibility, right? So if you have high humidity or if you have extensive water damage. Also the things like the presence of insects. And unfortunately, I didn't include any pictures here, but it's not uncommon to find manuscripts that have been extensively burrowed by insects and left all these little like tunnels and things. All right. So I want to talk just a bit before we start to look at some digitized manuscripts and at navigating them, and then we'll come back to paleographic issues afterwards. Briefly, for those who aren't sort of familiar with just kind of the material context of manuscript production. This is something I think that it's easy for us to forget, particularly as we have become, in the sort of hypermodern world, so used to producing text digitally to the point that many of us probably rarely ever write with a pen and paper. I mean, I guess some people do, some people don't. So it's, I think, even easier now than in the recent past to forget what the actual sort of context of scribal practice were and how scribes went about their work in producing manuscripts. Because, of course, as the word manuscript indicates, this is labor by hand. And I think that's something when you are interpreting manuscripts and whatever usage you have for them, always having in the back of your mind these material conditions of production is really important. And just sort of how this was done and just the labor that went into these things. When scribes and their colophons ask you to pray for them, you probably should, because they did a lot of work to bring these to us. I've given you here two miniatures, one from the Mughal and one from the Safavid world, that really beautifully depict what scribal practice looked like. So you'll notice a number of things in both of these miniatures. One, just notice the posture of the scribe. So unlike in the modern world where we're most likely for writing, longhand, we're going to be sitting at a desk. Scribes in the Islamic world tend to sit on the floor, and they're going to write on the paper with some kind of pad, and you can kind of see it actually here with this Mughal scribe. A flexible pad underneath with the paper on top, and the whole assembly kind of perched on their knee. So they're sitting with their knee up. And this is, by itself, a kind of a different sort of relationship to the page, to the text, to writing than we tend to have in our own world. So the writing seated on the floor, the text in close contact with their bodies. And you'll see that both of these scribes have the tools of their trade kind of scattered around them. So you can see in both cases we have inkwells. We have pages of paper in different stages of kind of production. So we have some pages over here with like kind of framing that either the scribe is going to write on or that he's going to maybe paste paper onto. Our Mughal scribe here has some of the other tools that are kind of visible. So we have some reed pins scattered around down here. We have what I think is either a sharpening knife or scissors. I'm not sure. I think these might be scissors, actually. And then we have his sort of toolbox over here. We have a completed, looks like codex right here, and then one that's being worked on. So, of course, the primary tool of the scribe for any style of writing, whether we're talking about writing it's majmua for oneself in a very quick, kind of inelegant scribal hand, or whether you're producing a very refined kind of calligraphic manuscript work, the primary tool is going to be the reed pen. And I encourage anybody who's not familiar with these things, to look on YouTube and find some examples of contemporary calligraphers at work using a reed pen. So these are relatively simple objects, right? They're cut from reeds. Then the reeds are cured through a really fascinating process, and then cut. And crucial to the reed pen is keeping the nib sharp, keeping it cut correctly. And so another crucial tool in the scribe's kit is going to be his knife, right? So and keeping that knife sharp. So you have that, and then your ink is going to be another super crucial item. Scribes are liable to produce their own ink. They may purchase it, but they're probably going to produce it as well. So all of this is very labor intensive, and I think it's always worth keeping in mind that when these manuscripts that we're dealing with, to produce them was a lot of work. It involved physical labor on the part of the scribe. It involved, if you will, kind of capital expenditures in terms of acquiring the material, of keeping the tools in functioning order, and of just producing some of the material. I've also given you an example here. This would not be typical of most scribal kits. This was a pen case and an inkwell that belonged to, I think, Ahmed III, the Ottoman Sultan. Obviously, most would be somewhat more humble than that. Let me think. Any other things with scribal practice? So this is kind of the materiality. We'll be looking a little bit further on at the actual of things like how scribes apportioned words on the page, how they did layout, how they interacted with the text, things like this. But I'm going to stop. I'm going to stop the slideshow now. All right. All right, so the next thing that I want to kind of shift gears a little bit. We'll come back to codicological and paleographic concerns, but I want us to think a bit now about, if you will, scribal practices in the 21st century. So best practices for those of us using digitized manuscripts. We are living in a period of just incredible abundance in terms of what is available online. And every year, if not every month, more material is being added. And the tools for working with digitized manuscripts are sort of continually expanding. Maybe it's not as much as in other fields, but it's still pretty impressive. And so what I want to do now is go over kind of the process of finding and using digitized manuscripts. And this is very much, I think, sort of work in progress as we collectively kind of figure out how to do this. The first thing I want to mention, before I forget it, that there are an increasing number of resources online if you want to kind of do self-directed paleographic and codicological study. So I'll just mention these three here. So a really lovely sort of set of modules from the University of Leiden that covers a lot of paleographic ground. It's very useful and is well put together. The Hill Manuscript Museum and Library, a repository we'll look at in a moment, also has a really lovely paleographic course. And then Jan-Jost Whitcomb also has, this is a little bit older, but it's some really good material. And between the three of these, there's a pretty nice spread of different paleographic, different script styles and sort of manuscript context. So if you're looking for kind of self-directed paleographic learning, these are all three really good resources. And I think in the future, there are going to be more resources made available as well. So there are lots and lots of digitized manuscripts on the internet today. The big question, and this is what I found in working with students and both and also in my own experience, is how do you go about finding them? Now, most people, I guess our sort of go-to intuition is we're going to Google something. Unfortunately, even if, say, let's say, the shelf mark of a given manuscript, or if you have a title or something, just a web search is probably not going to be very helpful. In some cases, you may turn up something, but generally, these catalogs, these repositories are either not going to be open to web searches, or they're just not going to be visible in the top 20, 30, 40 results. Unfortunately, there is not a single kind of central location you can go to search across archives and repositories. I wish that this were the case. It would be wonderful if there were like a union catalog of all digitized manuscripts, and if there were like an easy way to go about doing this, but unfortunately there isn't. If you know a specific manuscript, so let's say, in your, as you're looking through secondary literature, you find a manuscript that you think is interesting, and you have the library name and the shelf mark, that's pretty simple, right? You just figure out, is this repository, have they digitized stuff? Then you go to their catalog and you look and see if they have it. I will say, even with that, you should always be careful. The first iteration of the shelf mark that you enter may not pick up what you're looking for. And something that you'll discover, because these libraries and their catalogs are very geographically distributed. Some are in Europe, some are in the Middle East, some of them are in America. They all have kind of different conventions of metadata entry, of what they include in their metadata, and in things like transliteration. The latter is really important if you are looking for a specific text, or say a specific, like a keyword or something, right? So the transliteration that you use in, say, the Princeton catalog is not necessarily going to work for the Staatsbibliothek, right? And this can be really frustrating because you may not know initially, what the transliteration conventions are. So it's worth kind of exploring and figuring out, what combination of terms, what transliteration can you use to find what you're looking for. Some catalogs will let you use, they will have the Arabic script. Others do not. Some are only in transliteration. So let me just, so that's one issue. Another issue, and let me go into one to show you. Let's see. We'll pick the Bibliothèque Nationale. Another big kind of difference across archives is going to be what they allow you to download. So let's see. Some libraries permit full PDF downloads. So if they have a text, they might actually allow you to download the text in a lot of different ways. So for example, the Bibliothèque Nationale, this might be my browser. Of course, the first thing that I click on is not going to show up, so let me go back to a different source. Some are going to allow you full PDF download. Some will allow you to download like a page at a time. So for instance, this repository, this is kind of a number of different kind of smaller collections. So let's just search for Shah. So when you go into this one, everything is in individual JPEG or TIF files, which can be a little bit annoying. But that said, you have your choice, so different resolutions. You can click on it and it gives you this. So this is with the JPEG, but you can also do TIF, so it gives you a much higher resolution, which is really nice. Because another difference that you'll find across with different repositories, some have excellent high resolution, they have color scans. Others, particularly ones that started digitization pretty early on, the scans might be very low quality, right? Like you're often talking about just kind of black and white, often facing page, which can be a bit of an issue for transcription. And the resolution might be quite poor. And this is just going to almost not randomly vary, but it'll vary a great deal across repositories. In some cases, you might have microfilm that was created, decades and decades ago that then is digitized. So we're talking about kind of multiple layers of copying, right? And so obviously there's losses there. So here's this is a good example of Princeton. If we go down, so here we have kind of two things going on. So we have an in-domain viewer, but Princeton also allows, so here actually, we can download this as a PDF. Curiously, and this will be the case in some repositories, while it's in color here in the in-domain viewer, when you download the PDF, it's in black and white. Now, this may or may not be an issue. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. But fortunately, here you have the option. You can switch between a PDF and this in-domain viewer, which is in color. So some repositories will let you download everything, and sometimes, usually in different formats. Others, so like the Hill, do not. So let me sign in. And there are reasons for this. So if we go into the reading room, we'll have a look. By the way, I want to put in a plug for the Hill for a number of reasons. One, HMML is one of the largest, if not, maybe not quite the largest, but it might be, repositories of Arabic script manuscripts in terms of digitization. I forget the number, but I want to say in like the hundreds of thousands now. It's a massive number of digitized manuscripts. The only kind of issue, if you will, of working with the Hill stuff is you are limited to in-domain view. So you can use the viewer, and it's pretty flexible. So you can zoom in, you can go to full screen. But what you cannot do is download these texts as PDFs. And the reason for this is that these manuscripts are not owned by the Hill Manuscript Museum and Library. Instead, they're owned by collections and repositories around the world. So for instance, this is from the, what is this? This is, the Khalidi Library in Jerusalem. So this is stuff that they've digitized, that they host, but they don't, if you will, kind of retain the rights to. In different repositories and libraries and collections, they have their own kind of concerns in terms of sharing, what can be reproduced. So you'll find that across repositories, you're going to get a variety of ways of interacting. And so, sort of keep that in mind. The other thing that's going to vary, actually let me go back to the Hill because it's a good example, is what you get in terms of metadata. So for this entry in the Princeton catalog, this is an example of pretty copious metadata. So if we go down, we have a nice little summary note, more notes on copyist, some stuff described from the colophon, and then we have a very extensive table of contents. So in many cases, we have titles of the short works, we have the locations, And even better, within the in-domain viewer, you can actually navigate to these particular texts. This is fairly exceptional. So other repositories do not have this level of metadata or of ease of navigation. And even within the Princeton collection, it's kind of a little bit hit and miss. So some collections will not have this level of granularity. Others will. It's often helpful if you can, if you have physical copies of manuscript catalogs. So these may very well contain more data than you're going to find online. And again, it varies a lot from one repository to another. The Hill is another example where we have actually pretty extensive metadata that's very helpful. We get titles. There is some codicological information, so object description. Codicological information is one of these places where you probably the most variation. Some digital catalogs are going to contain virtually no information. Others have a lot. So if you're using the Hathi Trust, if you're looking for manuscripts in there, many of their manuscripts, if not all of them, are from the University of Michigan. And the information contained therein is really extensive. A lot of codicological information on script styles and stuff like this. Others are going to vary a lot more. So like pretty much everything in the study of manuscripts, the best thing to do is to explore lots of repositories to see what they have and what the formats, the limitations, and things like that are. I've given on this website a list, but this is not an exhaustive list. So these are kind of major repositories, but there are a lot of smaller ones kind of scattered around. And there are a lot of ongoing projects as well. Also in the Digital Islamic and Humanities, which I've given here. All right, so that's in terms of finding. The next thing that I want to cover is what do you do once you've found a manuscript? So something that you are already interested in, something that you discover, whatever the case may be. And here again, there are a variety of digital tools and methods that you can potentially use. And a lot of it's dependent on what you want to do. I find that in my own work, sometimes and honestly, probably the still kind of most effective way is just to download a PDF if you can, and obviously you can't always, and then just to work through the PDF. In some cases, you may want to download individual images at a higher resolution. So if there are details of, like really tiny minuscule script, if there are codicological details that you want to be able to look at, digital environments can be really, really helpful in this regard. And being able to download really high resolution, so say like a TIF file, can be really helpful because it lets you zoom in, right? Something that can be hard to do with a physical manuscript unless you like have a magnifying glass or something. Digital environments are really well suited for this sort of up close examination. That said, there are also limitations to digital environments. I'll just switch to one so we can think about it. One of the limitations, if we go back to thinking about the materiality of manuscripts, obviously when we're looking at a digitized exemplar like this, we're looking at an image of the book, right? We're not looking at the book itself. This is an image, a scan that has been made and that is flattened out. It's now in two-dimensional space. So the three-dimensionality, the tactile nature of this manuscript is pretty much lost to us, right? We can use our imaginations. We can read the dimensions in the metadata if that's included. But I find that in many ways, there's still something lost in that sort of translation. If we just think about the size of manuscripts, when you're looking at digital manuscripts, they tend to kind of go down to almost kind of a homogeneity. So let me pull up one here. Where did I put it? Oh, here we go. So when we're looking at a manuscript in our say PDF viewer, right? I can zoom in and out, but it's sort of like all manuscripts become the same size. When of course we know that this is not the case, right? That manuscripts actually vary a great deal in terms of size, and that the size of the manuscript can tell us a good bit actually about usage, what this manuscript was for, how it might have been employed, what it signified. These are things that are just kind of hard to reproduce in digital environments. They're not impossible. You can read the dimensions, you can kind of visualize it, but it's a difficult translation. So one approach then to using these is, of course, through the PDF. Something I do want to mention, even though it's not yet public, this isn't publicly available, there are others, is to use a transcription platform. So there are a number of these, which I won't go into. Probably the best known right now, I think, is something called Transcribus. But these are platforms that are designed to facilitate the transcription of manuscripts. And in some cases, also handwritten text recognition. The platform that our team is working on is visible right here, called eScriptorium. It's not yet available to the wider public. We hope to have a public rollout sometime over the next year. So we're working with a number of other teams in developing this for broader use. So I'm not going to say a lot about it just because it's not yet widely available. But the basic idea of a transcription platform like this is to help you transcribe the text and to kind of use the text. It also has sort of more layout-oriented features, but in some ways are kind of secondary. For transcription purposes, it is really useful, and I'll just sort of show why. Once you've prepared a text, you transcribe by going line by line. And this is, I think, is really useful because it forces you to kind of concentrate on a single line. And in paleography, I mean, concentrating on on words and letter forms and things can be really helpful. That said, sometimes it's a bit of a drawback because in paleography, being able to see patterns within letter forms is really helpful. And sometimes the best thing to do initially, even if you're using a platform like this, is to look at the manuscript kind of as a whole, to be able to look up and down the page relatively rapidly, to make connections between letter forms. You detect words that you're certain about, and then you can extrapolate from those to letter forms into words that you're less clear about. That said, once you start to get a feel for a particular manuscript's script style and sort of hand peculiarities, a transcription tool like this is really helpful. And what it produces, the end result, you can export your transcriptions as a plain text document and then do whatever you want to do with those. So whether if you're constructing editions of manuscripts, if you want to do computational analysis, which is, I think, eventually going to be more possible with manuscripts, and other things, platforms like this are very helpful. Like I said, this platform will be available in the future, so sort of stay tuned if this is something that interests you. So, all right. So I mentioned the benefits and some of the drawbacks of digitization. One thing I do want to mention, and this is a bit more, if you will, kind of a meta level. One of the wonderful advantages of digitization, and actually let me go into the Hill, because I think they exemplify this. Many manuscript collections around the world are, if not endangered, they're not necessarily in the best of conditions. So I actually tried physically to get to the Khazraee library a couple of times a few years ago, and didn't work out. And one of the reasons was that there was like a group of Israeli soldiers blocking the street down to the library. So it's a sort of good, snapshot of some of the issues facing manuscript libraries around the world. Right, they're not necessarily in the most stable socio-political situations, and also manuscripts just are subject to the vicissitudes of time. In India, for instance, there's a real risk to manuscripts from things like high humidity and conditions that just eat these things up. If they're not in a climate-controlled environment, over time they are going to deteriorate unless they're in, super dry climates. Digitization provides one way of preserving these manuscripts, for scholarly use, but also for other purposes as well. And it's important that we remember that manuscripts, whether they're Arabic script or in other traditions, these are not just sources of information, and they're not just objects of scholarly interest and inquiry, right? They exist for other communities and other people. They have other meanings and other purposes. And digitization can work towards some of these. On the other hand, there are also a couple of dangers, I think, and these are dangers that I know that at the Hill that they're definitely thinking about, because we discussed this some. Once you digitize something, there is often this idea in some circles, not in sort of scholarly or expert circles, but if we're thinking about in terms of people who give funding for things, right? That once you've digitized something, like, it's preserved, and then almost, do you need the physical exemplar anymore, right? Like, why spend money on physical manuscripts and keeping these things safe and, not turning into the food of worms or rotting if we have digital exemplars? And I think this is something that has to be pushed back against, but it is a potential kind of drawback of digitization, that it can lead to a devaluing of the physical object, which is problematic for reasons I just mentioned, that these objects aren't just sort of objects of scholarly interest, right? They have other meanings and other significances for the people in the communities that have produced them and preserved them, but also in terms of scholarly interest, right? Digitization doesn't capture everything. Different forms of digitization and different procedures capture more and less information, particularly on the codicological front. And continuing to have the physical objects is still important. The other thing too, and this is an issue, doesn't just apply to digitized manuscripts, but it's an issue across really the internet, is that digitization in anything online is not forever. And there's increasing awareness, I think, in many circles that what we produce online is subject to decay much more readily than we've tended to think, right? Just because we've uploaded something onto the internet doesn't mean it's going to be there forever. Unless, of course, it's like disadvantageous to you in your career, then it's going to be there forever. But other things are liable, there's decay. I could take you to at least a couple of repositories of digitized manuscripts that are no longer accessible because they depended on Flash, which has been deactivated, right, as of January of last year. And so all of that material that until a few months ago you could look at, albeit not the greatest of viewers, is no longer there. Presumably the files and some of the material is still extant. But as we all know, things like that can easily disappear. Information degrades, projects get shut down, they run out of money, people stop fooling with them, right? This is an abiding problem with all digital endeavors, but it's a definite issue with digitization. It's something to keep in mind. Anyway. All right, so those are some of just kind of a broad overview of using digitized manuscripts. There's a lot more that could be said, and in the bibliography that I'll provide, there's some more material that kind of pursues this more. So let me now actually go back to my slide, and we'll pick back up with just a few sort of codicological and paleographic concerns. Oops, didn't want to start from the beginning. All right. So going back to paleography and codicology, I'm going to talk a little bit about dating manuscripts and reconstructing, as much as we can, histories of use. And this brings us to what I think is one of the most important and valuable things about manuscripts as opposed to, say, printed editions of text. They let us see text as, if you will, living objects, right? As being composed by and for communities of readers and of users, and of thinking of books not just as kind of sources of information or as holders of texts, right? So the way that we tend to think of them in the print age, but as really these almost like organisms, almost like living communities that accumulate layers of interaction and participation over time, and that allow for the display and transmission and really kind of the doing of knowledge and of information in ways that just generally are not true of other media. This is one of the reasons why manuscripts are just so, I think, really exciting and such a rich area of investigation. Also very challenging, because the most interesting questions I think that we can ask of manuscripts also involve the most work, naturally. It wouldn't be any other way, would it? So if we're thinking about how do you determine the age of a manuscript, when it was written, there are a couple of very obvious approaches. The most obvious is to look to the colophon, so the conclusion of text or of the manuscript as a whole. And this will vary. So sometimes in a majmua, so in one of these composite manuscripts where you have a lot of discrete texts that are put under into one codex between two covers, right? The colophon with the date might come at the very end, so in the very last text that is copied. If, say, the scribe is copying a bunch of texts consecutively, and it's all in the same hand, right? So the colophon at the end might indicate the date of composition. More likely, though, each discrete text is going to have its own colophon, and the colophon will hopefully indicate a number of things. It will hopefully indicate the name of the scribe. So the one that I've given over here, it tells you that. Usually with things like, the poor, the sinner, et cetera, and then the person's name. It may indicate the place where it was copied. This is relatively rare in Arabic script to manuscripts. It's not unheard of, certainly. I wouldn't say that it's uncommon, but it's not super common, put it that way. It'll usually indicate the date as well, and there might, it might indicate the year. Oftentimes, it'll indicate the month, perhaps the day of the week as well. Sometimes even like the hour that the person completed the manuscript. And you're likely to also have some kind of like a request for prayer, maybe some pious phrases. The content of colophons varies a lot. So depending on where you are and when, you may get more information or you might get less. So for instance, West African colophons oftentimes do not include dates, which can be very frustrating. So you're left to other ways of figuring out of dates. You might be able to decipher the date based on the script style. Sometimes this is very obvious. So a 13th or 14th century text, after a little bit of experience and usage, you can look and say, yeah, this is probably a late medieval text in like a sort of late medieval Naskh. And there are a number of script styles that are like this. They're relatively stable and they can be identified relatively easily. If you're dealing with Nastaliq, you can get a pretty broad range, right? It's not like 11th century, you at least know that. In other cases, it can be a lot harder. So because some script styles are so stable over time, the chronological range might be quite great. And in terms of the technical literature, there has not been a great deal of more kind of fine-grained analysis. So tracing levels and sort of categories of script style below that of just like Maghrebi, Sudani, Naskh, Nastaliq, Shikaste, that sort of thing. This is something I think that we need more of in the future, it would be wonderful if we could kind of reconstruct some more sort of fine-grained histories of these script styles and how they evolved over time. But we're not really there yet. That said, with time, your eye sort of starts to see things. You can identify geographies, in many cases, chronologies, but it's not foolproof, right? So, Nosk gets used in the Safavid world. You can look at Nastaliq, and you may not necessarily know, is this Ottoman, is it Safavid, is it Mughal? Both because there is, scribes travel, for one thing. And so these styles often, they range across geographies. Another way to think about, to look for evidence of dates, is to look at all of the other material, written material that gets added to manuscripts over time. And we can only address a little bit of this. But these are things that can start to give you indications of history of usage. I'll just mention a couple. One are reader's notes and owner's notes. So manuscripts will often contain, and over here we have some. We have a Safavidic, I think this is Safavid, example, and a Yemeni example. In the opening pages, so either in the sort of the blank folios at the beginning, or potentially in your opening illuminated pages. And so both of these here have really lovely illumination, which these editions look a little bit, I guess, inelegant to our eyes, but this is sort of expected. This is, I guess, this wouldn't be considered too aesthetically displeasing. Where later users have added their hands, including indications. So you might have reader's notes. So in the case particularly of books that got loaned out from individual owners who would loan them out to someone, and then they would, the reader would write a note. They're likely to include a date. They may or may not. You will often get owner's notes. So often saying Sahib, Fulan, Fulan. Indicating who owned this book at a certain point, and that will often give a date. In some cases, you might get things such as in this Yemeni example, birth notices. So in Yemeni manuscripts, this is pretty common. So this indicates the birth of, I think a son. And it gives you a date, which is really nice. So here you can start to see, you can kind of build up in some cases dates that show you where this manuscript went, right? So it's going through different users and owners and readers who are leaving their marks on the manuscript. In many cases, it might just be a note at the beginning or the end, right? These owners or readers, they may not necessarily be leaving extensive marginalia or whatever, but they're leaving little clues and indications. And you may be able to trace the dates off of that. So I'm going to go back to that. In terms of histories of use, so we have these sort of, if you will, notations, almost like documents that are appended to these manuscripts. And then, of course, we also have marginalia, sort of more properly understood. And here we can really start to see how medieval, early modern, and modern readers of these manuscripts and users and compilers, how they thought about texts, how they interacted with texts, what they were doing with them, right? So if we go back, let me go back to the very beginning because it's a really spectacular example. Where is it? Yeah, so this is a Yemeni example, which is really, really wonderful, where we have your main text with all kinds of marginalia. I think in this case, maybe Shar, although I'm not entirely sure. The variation in layouts is something that's very striking, and this goes to kind of scribal practice. So Yemeni manuscripts often have this just, it's almost like a maze of text. In many cases, you will find, particularly in text meant for kind of like a madrasa context or in genres we would associate with, say, fiqh or with madrasa teaching, you'll often have the main text with lots of deliberate spacing, right? So both in the margins, but also within the main body of text. And this scribe may have been adding the marginalia as he wrote, right? Or it may have been added by a later user. Sometimes you can tell, sometimes it's a little bit hard to tell. And here we have, this is like one of the more spectacular ones I've come across, where I don't even know that we would say that there is a main text here. I think these vocalized lines here are, but we have just an incredible array of, well, let's just say, material, right? And it's in multiple languages. So we have Arabic, I think on this one page, Arabic, Persian, and Ottoman Turkish. And multilingual is very common in manuscripts. So here we have, this is a West African manuscript. Arabic in the main text. Again, we have the big wide, not necessarily margins, but interlinear space. And we have Ajami. So I'm not sure what language here, but one of a local language of West Africa, commenting and translating the text. I could go on about this stuff, but you kind of get the picture that there are all kinds of opportunities for reconstructing this history of usage, of interpretation, of interaction with the text, of readers and scribes themselves, creating these kind of multiple layers of meaning and of textuality within these things, and it's just spectacular, right? Kind of related in terms of reconstructing histories of scripts, of manuscripts, but also just in practical terms, is the variety of script styles, and I've put here through time and space because both are really relevant. And there's a lot of variation. It's kind of a truism that generally, if you can read Arabic script, you can generally pick up a sort of high quality manuscript and read it without too much trouble. And, for sort of prestige manuscripts, this is often true. Like, I don't think you need any particular training to read like a good Ottoman Nosk manuscript. Like I could, sort of starting out, I think most people can. But as you sort of expand your ambit, whether geographically or into other genres, you start to encounter a lot more variation. Some of this variation is in what we might think of broadly as script style. So I've given you some. Here we have Shakasta, we have Magharibi, of course Nastaliq, we have oh shoot, I've forgotten the name, not Bihari, North Indian. This is actually kind of a cool one. This came from, I believe, Haiti. So this is a West African script style transplanted into the Americas. And this is Southeast Asian and so forth. So we get geographic variation in script styles. We also get variation in terms of genre. So up here in the top corner, this is from a scientific manuscript. Notice also the diagram, which is another feature of manuscripts. You'll notice that there's minimal dotting in these, and this is something that is not uncommon in scientific manuscripts, with the rationale being that you don't need the dots if you're reading these things. So lots of variation in script style along a lot of different, if you will, kind of vertices or of meaning and of causation. Sometimes you can tell by looking at them what period they're from, but other times, as I mentioned before, it can be quite difficult. Likewise, you might be able to guess genre based on the script style or on the hand. Other times, maybe you can't. Finally, I think I'll conclude with this because we're going pretty long. In addition to text itself, and which can vary from obviously the main text to marginalia to scribbled notes or whatever. You also have a lot of other lines of evidence within a manuscript that can tell you about usage, significance, histories, and things like that. One of them will be things like usage, indications of just usage. So in this manuscript over here on the left hand, this is a Coptic Orthodox prayer book from I believe the 18th century. And as you can see, it's been extensively used. So we know that whoever acquired this, this didn't just sit on the shelf, but that it was used quite a bit. So we have the thumb marks. We also get a sense of how this book was held, right? That it was probably being used because it's a devotional book. That probably someone was reading along, right? In Islamic devotional texts, we can often see these signs of usage, both of people flipping through them frequently. If you have devotional imagery, you can also often detect signs of tactile engagement. So either someone touching the book, kissing an image, things like that. And these are things that are usually visible in digitization. You can also see things like stamps. So these are for owners or for readers. They're sort of on the line between kind of the visual and the semantic, right? So they have text within them that in some cases is almost like, been turned into an image. It can still be deciphered. So it's sort of borderline there. We'll often have dates, so these are also very helpful. Not easy to decipher, but they're worth tackling. On the same page, we can also see where things have been excised, right? So text that used to be there but isn't anymore. So maybe these were owner's notes, reader's notes. You might find things that were written in error. Sometimes here you'll just be left with mystery, right? So you may not know why did somebody go to the trouble of blotting this out, right? Why did they excise this text? And occasionally you'll find things that are actually cut out of a text and lifted, or conversely pasted in. And then a whole other sort of realm that I won't really touch on because I'm not at all an expert, actual imagery that you find within text. And the images that you find in the Arabic script to manuscript tradition, they run the gauntlet from doodles that are just sort of casually sketched to little illustrations like from the scientific manuscript of, I believe, comets or stars or something, all the way up to like Persianate miniatures and really sophisticated and detailed stuff. Along those lines, another thing also is the use of illumination and of sort of, we might say, decorations in more and less grandiose terms, and how these sort of fit within the manuscript, what they're doing, and how scribes and later users have interacted with them, right? Sometimes you can tell, were these produced by the scribe? It's also doing the writing. Were they produced in other workshops? This is going to vary a lot, and a lot will depend on the quality of the illumination. I'm much less qualified to talk about that sort of thing, though, so I'll leave that aside. So just a couple of things to mention in kind of wrapping up in terms of what you can do with manuscripts. So I guess, well, there are a lot of things, obviously, you can do with manuscripts, whether in the Arabic script tradition or in others. One of them is creating editions. So we might say critical editions and otherwise. This is one area where I think things have changed a lot in recent years. There's, for a number of reasons, some we might say praiseworthy and some blameworthy, there's less stress on creating critical editions than perhaps there was in the past. And like I said, there are a number of reasons for this. One of them is just that, let's be honest, creating critical editions, at least in the context of American academia, is not labor that is privileged. I'll put it that way, right? Like this is kind of something that you're expected to do if you do it at all in kind of your free time, which we all have, lots of. If you are interested in creating a critical edition, manuscripts, and particularly digitization, can be really, really helpful, right? You can gather multiple exemplars very quickly. So whereas in the past, if you wanted to create a critical edition of a text, you would have to travel from one archive to another, potentially separated by thousands and thousands of miles. Nowadays, you can spend a few hours, collect a bunch of PDFs or whatever links to in-domain viewers, and you have your manuscripts in front of you. If you're using one of these transcription platforms, like this improves things even more. And within eScriptorium and other platforms, you can make notes about orthography, about variation. You can kind of do whatever you want. You don't have to just copy the text, right? And one of the things that we're working on right now are sort of protocols and ways of doing transcriptions, producing training data and other formats, while also doing kind of note-taking and stuff towards either a critical or other apparatus for a text. And this is something that I think that there's potential for further development. Oh shoot, I can't. That said, there are some other reasons why critical editions maybe aren't always the best path in using manuscripts. Some of them are in terms of theory and sort of philological theory, right? The idea that there is a single kind of stable text, is a bit problematic, right? Particularly when we're talking about manuscripts. As we've seen just from the examples that we've looked at, manuscripts allow for a lot of variability. Some of this is not necessarily intentional, right? Scribes make mistakes. You're sitting there and your back gets sore, your knees start to ache, or whatever's going on. So there are scribal mistakes that introduce variation. But there's also deliberate variation, right? So there's editing, there's cutting down to size, things like that. And there's also the question of how are these texts actually received? And this is something that I'm kind of interested in, have been interested for a long time personally. One of the big, I think, outstanding questions is thinking about the Majmua. So these collective volumes, which I've mentioned kind of incidentally several times, but are worth looking at a bit more. So here we have, this is an example, and I just have a couple of kind of random ones pulled up, where you have, this is owner's mark, you have multiple texts. In some cases, as here, this is a single discrete text. It's just one page, then followed by another one. Somebody's added a title. And then as we go through, we have additional texts. At some point, they switch hands. Yeah, so here we have another hand. I think at some point we get, here's another hand. This might not have been the best example. I thought there was Nastalik in here, maybe not. This is actually mostly in the same hand. Oh, here we go. Okay, so here we switch. This is in a different hand, similar script style. So these are all discrete text. They've been collected and then bound together into a single volume. In a majmua, here's our scientific manuscript, you might have excerpts of text, so much longer books, if you will, or risala or whatever, that have been excerpted, edited, and then bound together. You probably wouldn't want to, in fact, you couldn't do a critical edition of a majmua because almost by definition, this is a kind of a one-off, right? What you would want to know is, things like what's the content of these volumes, right? Why has this scribe or patron or whoever made these selections? How have these selections been made? And then, are these texts have they been brought together in a way? Say, is there a running theme or a running commentary apparatus? What can you sort of detect out of these? Things like that. So depending on what your sort of use case is, what it is that you want to find out, you may want to work at creating either critical editions or, if you will, just kind of editions. But you might have other concerns as well. So, you might want to transcribe part of a text. You might want to have kind of a broad overview of others. So I hope that kind of covers that. There's obviously a lot more that could be said. But in general, I would say that digitization is very helpful for whatever it is that you're wanting to do in terms of these kind of bigger view projects.
Thank you so much, Dr. Allen, for this detailed and informative discussion. Before we conclude, I wanted to ask, are there any projects you want to tell us about that you're working on?
Sure. So, to be honest, most of my work right now is focused on training data generation. And actually, I can. No, I don't think I can. And a lot of that is kind of. So in terms of what I get to work on is partially determined on what we need in terms of training data. So one of the things that we need is layout variety. So one of the reasons why I brought up this text is I've been working on it because it has all kinds of stuff going on. We have these little diagrams and I guess equations. The content of this is beyond my pay grade, to be honest. This is on astronomy and related sciences. But in terms of layout, it's very complex. And so we've been working with material like this because it's very, very much what we need in terms of training data. The other thing that we, of course, need is variety of script styles, and so having a like geographic range is really helpful. So what I've been working with in terms of manuscripts is largely been determined by that. That said, I have some leeway, so I've definitely picked out works that I wanted to read anyway, which is kind of a nice little advantage. I don't think I have any pulled up right here. They're in eScriptorium at the moment. I will say, one of the, I think, drawbacks to digital environments is that you can be simultaneously working on a lot of stuff. And I do sometimes find myself not getting bogged down, but there's so many interesting manuscripts and so many texts and compilations that I want to investigate. It can be a little bit overwhelming, and you end up trying to do too much at one time. So, for instance, I showed this manuscript. I have not actually started on it. I need to. This is a copy of Mehmed Bergavi's At-Tariqa Muhammadiyya. So it's a pretty well-known 16th century Ottoman text. It's one of the most popular in the Ottoman world, honestly. It's in Arabic. And it's the focus of a lot of commentaries, so it's kind of standalone sharh. But manuscript copies also get Marginalia added. And one of the things I really want to do over the next couple of years is look at a bunch of these and kind of just examine how are readers interacting with this text. Because Bergavi, of course, very controversial, eventually becomes a pretty controversial figure, but also a very canonical figure. And his texts become very central to Ottoman Islam, but users have a lot of different reactions. And so one of the things that I want to do in the future is just go through these and look at the Marginalia. And see how are readers interacting with this text. How are they modifying it? Are they agreeing with it, disagreeing with it? What are they doing with it? This particular manuscript is kind of fun because as you go through it, we've got a fair amount of Marginalia. Here's some more. But then if we skip down a little ways, our reader, our note taker kind of slacked off, which anybody who takes notes in books or just takes notes about books will know the feeling. You start out strong, you're like underlining and you're jotting down things as you go. And by the time, you're about a third, 2/3 of the way through, it's, you don't do nearly as much. So some things don't necessarily change with time. And are familiar to all of us who interact with difficult texts. So,
thank you so much. And with that, I think we can just conclude the episode.
All right. Well, I've really enjoyed it, and this has been a lot of fun. I love talking about this stuff. It's so much fun, and there's just so. I mean, there's just so much, and I feel like it's the field that there's a lot of growth potential, to use kind of corporate speak. And that, I think digitization is driving greater interest in this material. It's definitely making it more accessible, and I think it's leading us to think about this stuff in ways that maybe we hadn't before. And for that, I think it's definitely a good thing. So.